Start recording. Excellent, Dave. Well, good morning, everyone who's joined, and I'm sure we'll have trickling in over the next 10 minutes or so. Excited to have everyone here on a 8 a.m. Friday morning virtual event. Welcome to the Oregon Bioethics and Humanities Colloquium presentation, The History of Medical Uncertainty by Dr. Vera Keller from the University of Oregon. I'm Tyler Tate, who many of you know, pediatric palliative care physician and one of the associate directors of the Center for Ethics in Healthcare. And we're here to kick off the virtual segment of OBHC. Before I say anything else, please mute yourselves and remain muted for the talk. You can keep your screens off during the talk, but then for Q&A, I ask that everyone turn them on if they can. So Oregon Bioethics and Humanities Colloquium, it's a 7-part endowed series that creates a space for thought-provoking discussion and exploration into complex bioethical and humanistic issues that revolve around philosophy, history, policy, and other forms of research. OBHC aims to create an environment that fosters critical examination of the human experience as we seek to provide new and innovative perspectives that I hope will challenge everyone who attends. So today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Vera Keller. Dr. Keller is an expert and historian in the history of science and technology in modern Europe. Her research explores the origins of modern science in early modern Europe from a variety of perspectives, including the relationship between art, craft, and experimentation, curiosity, wish lists, and futurism, the history of entrepreneurship and projects, and the relationship between science, technology, and politics, as well as its role in making modern scientific disciplines, scientific rhetoric, the origins of museums and research libraries, and knowledge management techniques. She's a 2020 Guggenheim Fellow in Intellectual and Cultural History. She's also the author of 3 monographs, Knowledge and Public Interest from 1575 to 1725, published by Cambridge in 2015, The Interlopers, Early Stuart Projects, and the Undisciplining of Knowledge, published by Hopkins in 2023, and forthcoming with Cambridge, Curating the Enlightenment, Johann Daniel Major, if I'm pronouncing his last name right, and the Experimental Century, and over 40 articles and book chapters on the development of the idea and practices of research in early modern Europe. She was particularly interested in the emergence of experimental science and entanglements of research with capitalism, colonialism, and political economy. And I'll say we talked about this talk some time ago, and I am very excited for her to bring a concept that we grapple with every single day in the hospital, which is uncertainty, and that in my own practice in pediatric palliative care is probably the most troubling and problematic phenomenon for families to grapple with, but to bring us a historical understanding of this concept so we have some better idea of where in the world we're coming from when we talk about uncertainty. I will let you roll, Dr. Keller, and then when you are complete, I will moderate a conversation using comments in the chat box, and people can raise their hands and ask questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation and everyone being here, as well as the introduction. And I'm excited for the conversation afterwards. So let me start a stopwatch so I make sure that I don't go over, so we do have time for that. So my talk today is going to be somewhat of a romp across 2,000 years, a little bit rough and ready. So we're going to be riding the wave of thinking about uncertainty versus scientific certainty, particularly the role of medical uncertainty in that discussion over a very long period. And I'm going to talk, break up the talk conceptually here into 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk about very, very briefly ancient discussions of medical uncertainty in Greek and Roman authors. And then the ways that uncertainty was really challenged by medical theory for 1,300 years. So there was kind of a diminution of the complexity of thinking about uncertainty that had existed. That also was the case. I'll touch on this briefly in part 2. in medical practice, the genres that were used in medical practice, very ancient genre of the recipe, doesn't really allow for explicit discussions of uncertainty. And so uncertainty, of course, always existed and continues to, but the structures of knowledge were not allowing uncertainty to really be inspected and discussed and managed. And that's what's really interesting to me and what I've devoted my career to thus far is thinking about what happened in early modern Europe when uncertainty became a really big focus and many new techniques were developed to manage uncertainty, techniques that we still use today and that are our research techniques. And it meant a breaking away of system and really a turning away from the idea that certainty is even possible, which may be a surprise. This is kind of a reformation of it's a rethinking of what happened to science in the early modern period. Many people will have learned about the scientific revolution, which is sometimes cast as a time when greater certainty was available. But I have devoted my career to exploring the idea that what changed in early modernity was really centering uncertainty and developing tools for managing it. So that's what I'll talk about in the bulk of the talk, which is part 3. And then I'll just end with by talking about some of the changes that happened to uncertainty when it became mathematized as statistics and risk, which is not the same as uncertainty and sometimes comes into conflict with it, and how that raises issues that are still with us today. And I'll just end really briefly talking about some of the issues, and then I'll have the bibliography available for further reading if you're interested. So it is a common refrain across, sorry, my screen just minimized my PowerPoint. So it was a common refrain across Greek and Roman authorities over 6 centuries that medicine is an uncertain art. So I just have listed here some major authorities in Greece and then in Rome over those 6 centuries, starting in the 5th century BCE. Hippocrates, very famous, first aphorism: life is short, the art long, the occasion instant, experiment perilous, decision difficult, really expresses the anxiety of being in this moment and having to act as a physician in a state of uncertainty. And the entire genre of aphorisms that he wrote in was meant to not have a systematic view of knowledge, but to have these very, very short, broken snippets of knowledge, precisely because you're navigating your way through an uncertain world. There is no path, there is no system, there is no overarching, well-conceived text that's going to give you all the answers. So the whole genre of aphorisms is meant to be certain points of wisdom to think with as you are acting in this really uncertain world. So it's a very interesting genre. It's a medical genre from Hippocrates, and it's going to be a very influential genre in this history of uncertainty. And Plato pretty rudely says medicine is boundless guesswork, but actual physicians and writers on medicine also agreed. Celsus says it is a conjectural art, and not only conjecture in many cases, but even experience is found not consistent with its rules. And then Galen comments on the aphorisms, and he says, by reason it is not easy in a disease to give judgment, but it is as difficult as anything imaginable. So this idea that you cannot develop a logical or rational system that's going to certainly give you all the answers. You're going to have to work with experience and with conjecture. Conjecture being a mental process which is uncertain and constantly trying to reconcile your conjecture with your experience. So we have here 2 ideas that are going to become really important many centuries later. One is the genre of the aphorism, this idea of breaking knowledge down away from system. And the other is the mental practice of conjecture, which was conceptualized in ancient Greece and Rome as a medical practice, and it's going to come back in a really big way in the 17th century. So this complexity of ancient positions was basically lost in the Latin West for a long time. It's preserved by Arabic translators, and here is a manuscript that's now in Washington, that is a copy of a much older copy, of course, of Hippocrates' aphorisms, and this is the way it would be preserved. What happened in the Latin West is that in late antiquity, after around beginning around the 4th century, um, a an approach developed to try to preserve ancient Greco-Roman learning by systematizing it. So this was an age of synthesizers, compilers, and encyclopedists who saw kind of knowledge crumbling all around them. They were desperate to save it. And so what they did is they collected it all and they thought of these ancient, very ancient authorities, because they're already ancient to them, as having developed a system, a harmonic system where everybody agreed and it all worked together. And they, by systematizing it, they hoped to preserve it by having it in this form that was easily transmissible. And so this is the time when they really developed this theory of correspondences that's going to be important for medicine for about a millennium after that, where everything in the human body interacts with the structure of the entire cosmos. And this is a little schematic diagram of that. It says mundus annus homo, the world, the year, man, meaning that the 4 seasons, the 4 elements, the 4 temperaments, the 4 qualities, the 4 ages of man, they all intersect. So it's not a very informative diagram. These kinds of diagrams that you see in these texts from, say, 600 or 700 CE are not really meant to give you information so much as to allow you to conceptualize the world as something that has a structure behind it. Your experience of the world may be different. So it is really meant to be a vision, a beautiful vision, that despite the violence and uncertainty that we experience in everyday life, there is the structure behind it. And people clung to that idea. And that really became the core of, as I mentioned, medical practice. You're probably familiar with this. At some point, you may have learned about this history of Galenic medicine, which was the really dominant medical approach where everything intersected. And it's very, very rational. So the idea here is that there is a methodical, rational way to understand everything that's going on in the human body. And that certainty is had a soteriological or religious component. The idea that the world, especially what was called the sublunar realm, the whole part of the world beneath the moon, was always subject to change. But there is a place that is not. There's a place where everything is eternal and certain, and the human role in the world is to find your way towards it. So knowledge was structured based on this view of the cosmos. This is the Earth here, surrounded by the planets and directly above that heaven. And your goal is to try to develop a form of knowledge which is as divine as possible, which escapes kind of the coils of the mortal realm, which escapes all of the uncertainty with which the human knowledge is wounded. And so this means that these kind of systematic approaches would explain away differences. They would explain away cultural differences. They would explain away differences of opinion, and they would explain away system breaking phenomena, which they would call monsters. So any kind of odd thing that came up was considered to be a blip in the system rather than a sign that the system was wrong. And our entire university system was built on this structure. So all of the basic education, the trivium and the quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts, were meant to be distinguished from the forms of learning through which you made a living, precisely because those forms of learning, which are considered not liberal arts, would introduce more bias into knowledge and would prevent people from escaping the human perspective and reaching towards something that was more absolute and more certain. The 7 liberal arts then prepared you for graduate degrees in medicine, law, and theology. So right there, you'll see a little bit of an issue because with medicine and law, you are really immersed in the human realm. It's also a profession. And so particularly medicine and law are going to be problematic for this entire system. And they're going to be bringing to it many of the issues with uncertainty that they had to struggle with in practice. So while physicians and lawyers continue to struggle with uncertainty every day, they were taught that that was not an appropriate view for science, that science was meant to be, the definition of it was certain knowledge. And this is a little personification of science. And you can see how science has wings on her head because her brain, her reason is supposed to be flying away from the world of the body. She's looking at herself in a mirror because she doesn't need to look anywhere else. She's based on reason, logic, on axioms, which are logical statements that prove themselves that do not need evidence. So 1 + 1 = 2. That is true in an abstract realm of mathematics. I don't need to go to the earth and use my senses to experiment to prove that. And so science, by definition, in this view of science, is not experimental. It does not rely upon the senses because the senses are known to be faulty. So obviously something big is going to change because that is not how we conceptualize science today. And that's why I'm so interested in my period, because there was so much experimentation in the breakdown of this system and in the changing of the conception of even what science is. This period is called early modern because it set in place knowledge changes that are still with us. And that includes the acceptance of the fact that knowledge is authored by humans. And as a result, we'll always have ongoing debates, change, and now what we call research. Research is not possible without uncertainty. Research assumes that we will continue to investigate. Investigation will not end. And that means that our prior knowledge is always in doubt. It is always available to be overturned. So that is the kind of theoretical, systematic view of nature and of science that was had kind of muted the discussions of uncertainty in ancient Greece and Rome, and was going to be a challenge for people in my period, early modern Europe, who wanted to bring uncertainty to the fore and kind of develop research. Another challenge comes from medical practice. So while we have Galenic medicine and all of these really beautiful harmonic theories of medicine that are being taught in the universities, we also have practices, medical practices, which differ a lot from the theory. And there is one genre which is still widely used by us today, which is incredibly ancient, which is the recipe. And the recipe is a genre that does not allow for much uncertainty. It is omniscient. It doesn't have usually a scribe and author, and it is imperative. So the word recipe itself comes from the imperative for the Latin word to take, recipere, because recipe, take something, was usually the first word in a recipe because it's a series of commands. You take this and you do that. It usually often claims that there are often claims of efficacy, that these recipes are certain, infallible. And when you read them, it's pretty interesting because there are a lot of recipes for very impossible things, and you'll see these claims that they work every time. And there really isn't any technology built into the recipe for itself for criticism. So the forms of criticism we're used to today, like, for example, peer review or footnotes, the recipe genre is not built for that. It became incredibly popular with the invention of print. Many collections of recipes, which were called books of secrets, were published and consumed widely. It was also heterosocial. People were experimenting in their house and developing recipes and exchanging them. There's a very large literature of that. You can see here The Secrets of Lady Isabella Cortese, which is one very famous and very early printed recipe book. And the personification of science is there again, with science staring into the mirror of herself, even though we're talking here about a knowledge that is practical and in fact really enmeshed in the senses. A continual challenge to theoretical physicians, to learned MDs, were charlatans. And charlatans is a technical term. It does not necessarily mean a fraud. It means an itinerant medical practitioner who went from city to city. There's one here you can see with the large feathered white hat sitting on a horse and showing off paintings of himself treating various patients. He has all sorts of testimonials to his recipes. And they used forms of entertainment, et cetera, to draw crowds to them. They drew great crowds to them. They challenged the medical authority of physicians. And they moved from place to place, so they were able to make great claims and then not necessarily be around for the results. And so they were able to make much greater claims than the learned physicians who stayed in one place. So as I said, they were not necessarily frauds, and they often had access to more knowledge than learned physicians because they did travel and they were much more involved in trade. And so they had very huge collections, growing collections of medicaments, especially via global trade. And so here's, for example, the sale catalog of one charlatan that I studied, Jean Mouffaz, who was highly respected by learned physicians in his time and would, in fact, live with them to teach them various practical methods. So, on the one hand, you have this Galenic theory of very systematic medicine, which is claiming certainty, but it is often not effectual when it comes to treating patients. On the other hand, you have charlatans who don't need to condone that system and claim a lot more certainty than physicians are able to do. And this led to a lot of criticism of medicine in early modernity. So, for example, Jan Baptist van Helmont, who is an alchemist who's going to be really important to the development of chemical views of nature, talks about how physicians are so known in the period for practicing an uncertain art that they're not able to promise or keep promises to any of their patients. And he says, unless we shall be able to promise and foreknow an undoubted end of diseases by answering for the most part the wished desire of the sick, it is a sign that the means and end do stand committed to a conjectural and uncertain art, where ignorance being the leader, and the way a path of uncertainty, darkness doth at length lay hold of him that goeth and leadeth through unknown paths. So he is really condemning the medical physician that walks in these unknown paths and has nothing but a conjectural and uncertain art to lead them, and is not able to fulfill the wished desires of the sick. By contrast to that, we have this recipe culture that is constantly claiming that it's effectual. And here's just one example, a powder for a weak back that never fails in one collection of recipes. So what do you do if you're a learned physician facing all of this? One response is to try to seek to regain control of the medical marketplace, assert your authority, and try to claim that you have access to certain knowledge. And that was one thing that happened institutionally in the 16th century, was the founding of these urban medical associations in many cities. And what they did is they gained the right in their jurisdiction to supervise all physicians, as well as all medical practitioners like surgeons, barbers, midwives, apothecaries, and charlatans that were coming through town. That was the model for one of the first scientific societies in Europe, the Academy of the Curious About Nature, which was a medical society. It still exists today. Became renamed the Leopoldina, and today it is Germany's National Scientific Association. And it was founded on the model of these urban collegia, but it was always correspondence based. So it was many physicians across a very wide geography who would write to each other and publish together. And its goal was to lock down certain knowledge. That was its original goal. And it had a publishing program where, in order to become a member of this academy, everyone had to publish a book on one medicament that was going to be the last word on the topic. It was going to be so authoritative, there would never be another book on that topic again. And in this way, the Academy aimed to develop a library of incredibly authoritative knowledge about medicaments so that they could remake the medical marketplace and kind of take back authority from the charlatans and other practitioners. This did not work. This method could not grapple with the incredibly changing knowledge of the period, especially through global trade, as different medicines were encountered and tested in various ways. And its efforts to say the last word meant that authors threw the kitchen sink at every topic. So this is a book, I actually own a copy of this book because I love it so much, by Philip Jakob Sachs, one of the founding members of the Academy of the Curious About Nature. And it's a book about one medicament, so-called crab's eyes. They're not really crab's eyes, they're a stone. And Sachs is trying to say the last word about this object. And so you can see how hyphenated his title gets. It's a physical, philological, historical, medical, and chemical consideration of everything in an effort to be systematic and to write the final word. He really tries to talk about everything in this book. There are so many topics that are in this book. So this was highly criticized because we're at a period when many naturalists are rebelling against system and rebelling against the idea that it is even possible to ever have a perfected and finished knowledge. So they criticized that model. Sachs was the one who decided to found a new approach to the to knowledge. He founded a medical journal. So it still exists today. Actually, this has been published now for several centuries. This is the first issue of the Journal of the Academy of the Curious about Nature, called the Miscellanea Curiosa, that began appearing in 1670. So this idea of medical journals is obviously incredibly important to us still today. And it's one of those fundamental early modern frameworks that were established in order to center uncertain knowledge. The whole temporality of a journal, which is a periodical, means that you can never say the last word on a topic. There will never be a book that you publish that is the end of research. The idea is that you are in an ongoing discussion over time, and that you will be able to refer back to exactly who said what when, to contest their ideas, to have a whole discussion, basically to do what we call research today, because you cannot offer the last certain word on a topic. And it's designed for critical debate. So it's designed to think that the articles that are published are open to criticism and therefore are uncertain. So many monsters and other objects touted by traveling charlatans were published in this journal. So if you look at it superficially, it looks incredibly credulous that these physicians are publishing all sorts of phenomena that are not real. This was a basilisk that was touted by a charlatan all over Europe. And because this was a correspondence-based society, many physicians were able to see this same object as it traveled around. The idea that the journal was publishing all these things meant that the Academy was now subject to a different criticism. Before, they were criticized for being too systematic. Now they're being criticized for being too interested in strange and weird phenomena that go against expectations, that go against systems. But what they were doing was publishing this doubtful knowledge in order to criticize it and explore it. So, for example, the editor of that volume offered a critical note based on his own viewing of this object. And he hypothesized that it was the wings of a marine ray that were sewn onto the body of a chicken. So he's kind of anatomizing this monster. And the editors, furthermore, defended the very approach of publishing kind of uncertain or incipient or tentative knowledge. So when they were subjected to criticism for having what seemed to be reports that were not believable, they defended this whole idea. So the journal editors said in 1676, in response to this criticism, we do not only admire the paintings that an Apelles, a Titian, or a Dürer finished, but also the first lines they sketched. And so there's a sketch by Titian on the screen. And the idea being that they're presenting knowledge in this state. It's not a finished painting. It's just a sketch. It's very incipient. You don't know which part of this is going to go into the final work. But the idea is to put it out there so that together we can have a conversation and we can raise doubts and focus on uncertainty as a better approach to knowledge than pretending that our knowledge is already finished. And again, in 1680, they said, it never entered the mind of the praiseworthy Sachs, the creator of this journal, nor that of his colleagues and successors, that everything that is collected in the journal should be received as though it constituted the indubitable and infallible truth. So they're putting out knowledge there, knowing that it's uncertain. This is a huge change. In order to publish and to be an author, the very meaning of that before this period meant that you were claiming that this knowledge was true. So the idea that you could be publishing uncertain knowledge is one of the big changes of this period. So one figure that was instrumental in that change was Francis Bacon. And you may have learned about him as the inventor of scientific method. He was not the inventor of scientific method. That's a very persistent myth, and I'm not going to talk about the history of the scientific method today, but that could be a whole other, of course, talk. what he did was encourage this focus on uncertainty and moving away from claims to certainty to a focus on it. He himself was a lawyer, so he did draw upon law quite a bit to do this. Many of his key words, like fact and matters of fact, come straight out of the courtroom. But medicine also played an extremely large role for him, and it would continue to play a large role in the development of infrastructures and views of changing uncertain knowledge. So one of the things that Bacon did was invent various forms of wish lists, or what we might call a research agenda. So in the end of one of his major syntheses of his ideas, he publishes this catalog called A New World of Sciences, or Desiderata, where he's inventing the term desiderata as things that are missing. So things that we wish for in knowledge. He is moving this idea that physicians cannot fulfill the wish desires of their patients. We saw that criticism to a plane of what do all people want to know, and trying to focus research on achieving those kind of much larger desiderata. He also adopted the ancient medical genre of the aphorism. So rather than offering a systematic method, which is the kind of story about Bacon that is told very often, he was attempting to break down system, and he did so by using the aphorism. So if we think about the various genres through which folks try to frame their approaches to knowledge of nature, we have many that are new in the early modern period for uncertain knowledge, as well as several resurrected ancient genres. And this is a really, really rough and ready chronology. There's a lot of detail, obviously, and complexity to each one of these. But the genres that were out there for claiming certainty were recipes, rules, axioms, systems, manuals, method, and textbooks. These are all quite old in the early modern period. The ones that people like Bacon were emphasizing were those of uncertain knowledge. So aphorisms and observations, which was a specific medical genre, the observatio, that was resurrected from antiquity in the 16th century by physicians. Conjectures, another medical genre that was resurrected. And then new genres, essays, which means an attempt, a project. Desiderata, we just heard about. Hints, one of my very favorite genres, and journal articles that I also touched upon. So you can see all these different techniques for dealing with conjectural and uncertain and changing knowledge that was novel in the period, and in which medical uncertainty would play a big role. We can think about this change in knowledge that happened in early modernity from a claim to systematic theoretical knowledge to an acceptance that knowledge is always uncertain or probabilistic because it is human authored rather than divinely authored. And then there are various genres, these uncertainty genres, I call them, that I have spent my career working on, that are attempting to shift knowledge towards, shift the object of inquiry towards more knowledge. But we're always going to be on this continuum somewhere in the middle there between ignorance and knowledge. And in the early period, people were very interested in breaking down the system. So they were very interested in developing techniques that were purposefully kind of loose and hazy, saying somewhere out there, we don't know where, we don't want to kind of preclude potential for discovery, so we're not going to direct it too much. And this is an early article about this idea of specifying what you don't know. Now the history of ignorance is becoming a bigger and bigger topic in the history of science, and this is so kind of rather early look at it, where Robert Merton says that specified ignorance, or writing down what you don't know, hints at various other kinds of and shades of acknowledged ignorance in science. So what I like about this is this idea that there are many different types of ignorance, and they have their own histories, just like many different types of knowledge do. So when we talk about uncertainty, we're going to have to unpack what kind of uncertainty we're talking about and how they interact with each other and what their specific histories were. So physicians were at the forefront of experimenting with different genres for writing about experimental knowledge, which was not systematic, which is based on the senses, which is subject to critique, which changes over time. And here's one of my favorite authors, Theodore de Mayerne, he was a Huguenot royal physician in England who has so many manuscripts. He experimented on a daily basis. Here he is in a rather magnificent red silk toga painted by Rubens. And he experimented a lot with crafts and with dyes and with color changes. And if you're interested in that, we can talk about that. But what I just want to point out is this page from one of his notes of his experiments, where you have the observation, which again is a specific medical genre, which is taken up centrally in experimental philosophy at this time. And you also have this speculation underneath it. So that's the method that he always uses. He has the observation and then he has his speculation afterwards. And he puts his monogram next to the speculation. That little shape that looks like an M is his Mayerne monogram. And we might think about this as very possessive, and it is. But it is also a way to give a specific author to a speculation rather than to voice it like a recipe would without necessarily a specific author. And by having a specific author, it opens it up to debate. You can say, well, Mayerne speculated this, but my observation shows that. So this is one of the big changes that is coming in knowledge. These desiderata form the experimental agendas in the first scientific societies. So, for example, here's a little list from the Archives of the Royal Society in London, where certain experiments are assigned to different members of the society. This is a list that is assigned to Dr. Jonathan Goddard, and it is first written as desiderata, and then they crossed it out and wrote experiments on top. So desiderata became the main way to think about what experiments need to be performed, precisely because experiments are the key way to deal with knowledge that is uncertain. Medicine was very prominent in this effort, so many desiderata lists were circulated in manuscript but were not published, precisely because they were so unfinished and open-ended that they went against a lot of the mores about publishing, where people thought that you had to produce something that was a little bit more finished and certain. So the first desiderata list, as I mentioned, was published by Bacon. The second was by Leibniz for law, and the third was for medicine. So you see that law and medicine coming here again very prominently to offer a model of knowledge that is very open-ended. And so this is the published and the manuscript version of this medical desiderata, which was the third desiderata list ever published. And medicine continues to remain very prominent in the publication of desiderata. This fellow, Johann Hermann Furstenau, made a whole career of publishing desiderata lists from 1709, which was his dissertation for the medical degree, all the way to 1727. He just keeps on coming out with more and more and more desiderata. Surgical desiderata, desiderata concerning materia medica, medical forensic desiderata, it goes on and on. In these changes to knowledge, a lot of that was happening outside the academy, and professors had to struggle with how are they going to transform their whole pedagogy and the disciplines of knowledge, which we saw the 7 liberal arts were set up to offer certain knowledge. How are they going to transform that and create new ideas about discipline that is based on dealing with experimental, probabilistic, and uncertain knowledge? So that was a key challenge in the latter half of the 17th century, and that's what my most recent book is about, which focuses on this figure, Johann Daniel Major, who was one of the first to offer an experimental seminar in a university. He was the first chair of medicine at the University of Kiel. And one of the ideas and virtues that he tried to instill in his students was the ideal of epistemic humility, which I think is a really important one, which I also try to teach. This idea that even though I'm a professor, I do not have the answers. I am working in a world that is, knowledge is always changing and uncertain and open to critique. That was a very different position to strike than those that his own professors had, who saw their role more as transmitting this theoretical approach that is going to help you escape the human condition. Major felt that there was no escape to the human condition. And this is a book that he wrote about, it's called Genius Errans, Erring Genius. And that little figure, winged figure, is his personification of his own mind, which he sees as pursuing knowledge, knowing that he will never be successful in finding everything that he wants, knowing that it will always remain uncertain. And he's this kind of fragile butterfly-like figure, but he pursues it nonetheless. So this is the stance that he's striking for his students, that we are in this world where knowledge will always remain uncertain. What we need to do is just figure out how to flutter our way through it. And that's the pose of epistemic humility he is transmitting. What's happening in early modernity that helps this, and this is a term that has come up a lot already in the Academy of the Curious About Nature, the Miscellanea Curiosa, is this idea that curiosity, which was often considered the opposite of science and a vice, is not a vice, that curiosity is the way that we should be approaching knowledge. So this idea of flying throughout the world seeking knowledge, which Meyer personifies as his little butterfly of his mind, you can see the personification of curiosity on the right there, where her wings are on her body and she has ears all over her dress. In contrast to science, because the idea is that she uses her senses. She flies about the world. She looks for kind of sensual, factual evidence. But it could be in a very, very uncontrolled way, as her hair is, unkempt hair is attempting to convey. The curiosity could just roam around the world, eagerly seeking secrets, and it could be pretty untamed and violent. And my most recently published book is about that entangling of this kind of unleashed curiosity with global capitalism. And academics had to figure out how to take this unleashed curiosity and make it into some form of a discipline. So this is really the crafting of curiosity-driven research, which continues to try to overthrow what has been previously known, and so continues to center uncertainty. And academics really had to figure out a way to kind of make this manageable. And so what they did is they tried to bring kura, or care, to curiosity. Curiosity's etymology is the same as care. And just as physicians care for patients, Meyer, through the stance of epistemic humility, tried to develop techniques for caring or curating knowledge, which is why I entitled my book Curating the Enlightenment. Other people also attempted to develop various techniques to grade degrees of uncertainty and reliability. So here, for example, is Robert Boyle's medicinal experiments. He was not a physician. He never graduated college. But he was, of course, a very esteemed chemist. And this is probably the book through which the public knew him best. This went through many, many, many editions. And what he does here is he gives a grade to different recipes based on how reliable he thinks they are, A, B, or C. And so the recipe does not have an inbuilt structure for doubt, but he is providing this kind of framework. So this one, a choice medicine for a sore throat, which many of us might be experiencing right now, is graded A. So Boyle says, you can really rely on this. This is extremely reliable. So it's still not certainty, but it's a way to grade various degrees of reliability. So now I'm going to be heading towards my conclusion. This is the last part to touch on the way that uncertainty then becomes mathematized. It intersected, and really medical uncertainty formed the model for human sciences in the transition from the early modern to the modern period. And I really love this drawing. Dr. Johann Matthias Faber, who's a member of the Academy of the Curious About Nature, you can see he has this drawing of the globe, and it has the human body stretched across it from the head to the toes. And his idea, he wrote this whole manuscript about the investigation of the body. There's a lot of very colonial New World rhetoric, as you can see, pervading this whole idea of investigating the unknown. And he wrote this as a political history of the body. He talked about diseases as various attacks from enemy camps, etc. And so this manuscript really speaks to this kind of intersection of the language of medicine and political history of the period. Politics took on aphorisms from medicine as one of its main genres. And they thought about the body politic as through medical terms. And so they were drawing upon a lot of kind of medical approaches. This included the development of tools of probability, demography, and statistics, which really developed hand in glove between medicine and political economy in the 17th and 18th century. And this gave uncertain forms of knowledge a sense of assurance, even though it remained epistemologically uncertain. The mathematization of it gave people the sense that they had more something to rely upon, which is sometimes a deceptive sense. So some of the figures who worked on this were, for example, the physician Sir William Petty, who developed what he called political arithmetic, which we consider one of the first efforts at statistics. And he used various sources like London's Bills of Mortality, which documented various deaths to study disease, epidemiology, etc. He did this not as a theoretical enterprise, but because he had some really major projects for social engineering, including transforming a lot of colonial populations and including transforming the economy of England. He had huge ambitions. He and others also used mathematics as a way to think about these kinds of large numbers of people. And they took their mathematics from gambling and developed all sorts of analysis of chance. Hawkins published his Value of All Chances of Games of Fortune in 1657, followed up by Jacob Bernoulli, The Art of Conjecture. So this conjecture, which had been a medical art, which had been done kind of qualitatively, is now taking on a quantitative form. And his family member, Daniel Bernoulli, brings this to medicine in publishing an essay advocating application of this probability and game theory to the likelihood of dying due to variolation. And Bernoulli argued that variolation was worth it if your risk of death was less than 11%, because of the number of years you would likely gain if you did survive the process. And there ensued a whole debate about whether probability in this way should be applied to decisions about life and death. And Jean d'Alembert strenuously argued against the application of probability to health. So many of these debates are debates that we still struggle with today. They have not gone away, of course, and they've become really prominent in recent years. I really like this piece called Technologies of Humility that once again speaks to that idea of epistemic humility that I was referring to earlier. And in this piece, Sheila Jasanoff writes about the way that we present ourselves in the public sphere is we hide our uncertainty and we present ourselves as experts. And this can, of course, engender a backlash when our uncertainty is revealed. But also it's problematic for the politics of science that the public should be invited into the process of debating critical questions because so much is at stake for them in these questions. And so, as Jasanoff says, critically important questions of risk management cannot be addressed by technical experts with conventional tools of prediction. So this is the same debate that d'Alembert and Bernoulli were having in 1766. So just to conclude, the genres and tools of medical uncertainty, I argue, profoundly shaped the major changes in knowledge that later would be called the scientific revolution. And the mathematization of uncertainty as probability and risk then raised some new debates, which we still have not fully resolved, and which are becoming much more complex right now due to machine learning. There's some really interesting scholarship about how machine learning really highlights some issues with uncertainty for clinicians trying to apply machine learning in a clinical setting. But I want to encourage us to think about uncertainty not as this dismal state that is inescapable and that we always find ourselves in, but it's a potentially rewarding and generative position. If we think about epistemic humility, that we ought to accept that we are in an uncertainty was a kind of a bold move. It overturned a whole system of theoretization, which was not really helping patients at all. And from this position of uncertainty, we can figure out ways to care for knowledge in order to assuage the pitfalls posed by risk. Thank you. And if you're interested, I have some suggested bibliography about this.
Wow, thank you. That was fantastic. I always, when I bring in a speaker who is doesn't have sort of a clinical role in their sort of life, there's always a little tiny thread of anxiety I have that it's gonna go over in a way that someone who doesn't have a background in history would not be able to benefit from. And that was so absolutely not the case. So thank you, Dr. Keller, for really bringing it, doing a marvelous job of having accessible theory that bears on what we actually do. So for those of you who want to, feel free to turn your camera on, and you can type some questions in the chat, and then we can have a conversation. Bob McCauley has a couple questions to clarify who the Boyle and the Bernoullis are that you were mentioning. If they're the Boyle's law and pressure, and the Bernoulli of physics of sailing and flight, which I imagine they might be the same.
They are, yeah.
While people think of a question or two, I'll ask a question that I'm as interested in hearing. They're two sort of historical questions, but how did the kind of the ancient conception of the great chain of being, that we're all sort of we have our place in the universe, we can't really get out of it, and that I don't really know. I've read a lot about sort of how that impacted social life and sort of European economies. But what I don't know is when that sort of the relationship between that sense of place in the universe and uncertainty and kind of the scientific method, if they were related. I'm sure they were, and kind of how.
Absolutely. So the great chain of being is the structure that's holding to place that entire system that is being questioned in the 17th century. And particularly the idea that the human body is a microcosm of the macrocosm. And so anything that's found in the human body should be reflected and related to something that is found outside in nature. And people were attempting to systematize and theorize that and treat humans that way. Rejecting the great chain of being is rejecting the idea that humans have any special place in the universe, that there's any relationship between the various parts of the chain. So you basically start from scratch, that we're all just matter, and it is indistinguishable matter, whether you're a human body made out of material, whether you're a lamp here on the desk. They don't have a specific place in the cosmos. So that is a massive, massive shift in thinking. And that's exactly what's going on in the 17th century. In fact, this person I'm focusing on, Mayer, has what he calls a new approach to anthropology, which is exactly that. It's to study the human cut off from the chain of being. What he likes to do, he has a strategy where he takes ideas that he wants to attack, and he actually takes that idea as his main topic, but then offers, kind of guts it and offers a whole new interpretation. So he, in fact, presides over a dissertation called On the Golden Chain in the University of Kiel, which is taking the whole golden chain of being idea and interpreting it to be the opposite of what it was supposed to mean. So very specifically attacking that idea. The alternative isn't great either. The alternative that we're all just matter and floating about in the cosmos, and the way that we're going to decide our way through the world is a risk-benefit analysis of, utility, is not a very inspiring vision. So the chain of being had a vision. It was constraining for a lot of people, saying you're here in the chain, don't try to go there in the chain. But it was a vision, and it was very beautiful in many ways. And one of the arguments of Interlopers, my second book, is that the unchaining or undisciplining of knowledge, which in older literature was cast as this kind of wonderful moment of the freeing of the mind of man, and the ability to have an infinite universe. The way that was enacted in the world was colonialism. It was, I no longer have the specific place, which was also geographically delimited in the world. Everything is placeless. I can take knowledge from here. I can go into that area and transform it in this other way. And so it becomes this, the attacking the chain becomes a way to kind of unleash curiosity in this very violent sense that I was talking about. So that's what my second book is about. And then the third one with Meyer was how academics tried to rein that in and critique it. In fact, they critiqued the direct application of curiosity to utility, precisely because it led in some very negative directions.
Wow, that's so rich. Thank you. I think it's so important for people who do clinical work to recognize that so many of the concepts that we just take as given are, have a history and also are up for grabs in a lot of ways, and that there's a politics and a sort of dominion to these ideas that they need to be enforced for a lot of reasons. But I'll Chris Alpia Minch says, this is terrific. What are your thoughts about presenting this to librarians? And here's a question. And what about the idea that desiderata is now a term most associated with development offices' fundraising wishes rather than recommendations for future research?
Well, desiderata have gone in all sorts of different directions. So because it is not often that people I tend to take this very overarching infrastructural view of the history of knowledge, which is an unusual approach. So this is why the whole history of desiderata was forgotten. And there's a lot of charting of how it developed in different ways to be done. I've done a little bit of it, but there's so much more. And it developed in various niches very differently. So desiderata are huge in libraries and collecting. They're for objects that you want. They became really big in a lot of ways, but the main purpose of them has now been overtaken by other terms. So you may have heard about like audacious ideas. I think there's various medical associations who sponsor various competitions to propose various audacious ideas, and those are really more the original sense of the use of the term desiderata. So this whole kind of practice of listing massively ambitious desires for the future is still going on in many domains.
I have another question. Thank you for the talk. Framing of uncertainty and assumptions connects these periods together nicely. I'm reminded of Galen's original brain anatomies having sheep structures and Galileo's uterus having horns. How we build and maintain this knowledge from history is fascinating. More of a comment. Does anyone else have a question? Because I have another question. I have a bunch of questions, but I feel like this is probably a question a lot of people have on their minds. Wouldn't surprise me. But when you look at, well, I'll couch this in a question. I was recently heard a talk from an American historian, and it was a talk about Lincoln. And afterwards, someone asked, "So is it the case that is it truly the case that this is the most divided America has ever been?" And the historian said, "No, it is not." That is the impression that is being sort of given to us by the media and in our own lives. However, we haven't yet fought a war, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if taking your historical understanding of uncertainty and conflict, and sort of this tension between that there's the way that things are, and then versus like we have to use our experience and we're never quite there, which I think we see right now in our current, the everyone is talking about the loss of trust in science, and just every New York Times article seems to be about that right now. So how do you, from a historical perspective, see that? Do you see it as a crisis? Are we in a crisis of knowledge, or is this just sort of par for the course, the result of this kind of enlightenment project?
It's mostly par for the course, and machine learning does have some new challenges to pose on this discussion, and we don't have answers on it yet. But it's not the first challenge that we face. We faced many so-called crises over the last several centuries, and so we've been surfing this wave. It is just the MO. So it is nice when you do take that historical perspective it's a little bit calming to consider that this has just we're always dealing with one or another challenge, and it's just part of research. I think what's really important though is that idea of humility and the technologies of humility, that to present that and to teach that also in K through 12 education as part of the scientific process, I think is so important, because what is taught instead to students often is this idea that you follow a method, you get a result. And it's a very mechanical approach that suggests, a degree of certainty that has never been the case. And for a lot of historians of science, it's been a real challenge right now to know what to do ethically, because our whole discipline is looking at how science and society have intersected, how a lot of knowledge that we think of as objective has been framed by various, social views. And given the politics, a lot of historians of science have become shy about discussing these ideas because they don't want to promote the weaponization of uncertainty, which has happened in a lot of areas. For example, bans on gender affirming care often are based on the uncertainty of the knowledge of these approaches. And so that is one of the reasons legally given to ban them in many states. So we kind of get worried about the way that our research is going to be utilized in the public sphere. But I remained convinced that the appropriate response is to continue to discuss this theme of uncertainty. If we attempt to present a view of practice to as though we were experts that had all the answers, we are only going to be encouraging the backlash. So I think that we need to kind of embrace uncertainty as this kind of situation that we're never going to escape. It has been with us for centuries. And in fact, it's very generative, and it is what we owe kind of our research practices to. And if you're interested, I could talk more about all of the different research practices like footnoting and bibliographies, et cetera, that developed precisely to help this. So it was very generative in the whole research infrastructure. And we can continue to develop new techniques to manage uncertainty in new ways as it continues to change.
Well, thank you. Well, we're sort of out of time. This was even, Dr. Keller, more than I was hoping for. We'll have this recording, we'll have your citations, and then we'll perhaps have to have you back to give a part two, which I think there are probably like 50 different part twos that we could have. But yeah, I anticipate that we'll be talking about this for some time.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, and I'm gonna do a little clap hand there. There we go. And we appreciate you, and good luck with the rest of your conference.
Thanks.